to the trenchers of this world. Between centuries of suffering and torment, many stories can be told, of good and evil, faith and heresy, naive longing and forbidden desire. In another age, the veneer of civilization would have been thicker and the boundaries between categories more blurred. But this is not the age of the Trench Crusade. Here, moderation and coexistence are as thin as molecules, and great devotion is contrasted by utter hate. They are, after all, the same. The predator devours the prey. It cannot help itself. The angel cannot shed its light without burning the eyes of the innocent. So let us listen to their stories, lives and no life spent unnoticed, not only surviving but living and existing, if only for a moment. Let us listen to the voices of the trench. The Vivisector's Vow. In the festering shadow of a city claimed by flies, where the very air hums with damnation, an ordinary defiance takes root. A handler of infernal beasts and a scribe marked for a terrible transformation find their childhood bond rekindled not by nostalgia, but by a shared desperation to survive. Their flight from the rival hells of Avignon becomes a journey through drowned sanctities and treacherous bargains, where the only tools for salvation are a stolen weapon of holy pain and the fragile, stubborn will to reclaim a future from the jaws of plague and despair. This is a story of escape, not to a paradise, but to the cratered fields of an ongoing war, where a chance to face the dawn is a victory in itself. Chapter 1. Mud and Honeyed Bread. Avignon squatted under Beelzebub's sway, a city where the air itself had curdled. It tasted of cold iron and the sweet, cloying rot of things left too long in the damp. The grand cathedral stood desecrated, its spires now a perch for things with too many wings, and along its processional way the missionaries of the Black Grail paraded. Their forms were a blasphemous mix of unclean beast and high clergy, their missionary zeal a plague in itself. They moved to the sound of headless psalms hummed by choristers, their severed necks pulsing with unholy music that frayed the nerves of any who still possessed faith. Along the trench-lipped rail yard, sentient barbed wire breathed in slow, coiling rhythms, tasting the air for the heat of the unwary. Nico Lorraine, 19 and press-ganged into this hell, spent his days in the mud and stink of the rail yard. His assignment was to the yoke fiends of a Praetorian cohort. These creatures were the twisted, stillborn offspring of cursed devils and beasts, crossbred by infernal biopriests in the foundries of pandemonium. Filled with an eternal, envious hatred, they were fit only for endless labor and torment. Nico's life was a cycle of mucking their foul stalls, oiling the intricate gears of their torment harnesses, and tagging the clay jars that held counted human souls destined for the goetic engines of the Praetor Magistrate. It was a life of gritted teeth and stolen moments, each one a tiny rebellion. One such moment was for Elodie Mercier. She was 22, a scribe to the missionaries, her delicate hands tasked with cataloging plague liturgies and tending the headless choristers. Their childhood bond, forged in an Avignon that was now just a ghost of memory, flickered back to life in the shadow of a frog-choked cistern. The air here was thick with the croaking of bloated amphibians and the smell of stagnant water, a small pocket of festering nature amidst the industrial inferno. Nico's heart hammered against his ribs as he slipped the piece of honeyed bread from inside his tunic. It was stale, the honey crystallized, but it was a treasure he'd risked a lashing for. "Here," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse and the ever-present dust. Elodie turned from where she'd been staring into the murky water. Her eyes, once the color of a summer sky, were now shadowed, haunted. But when they landed on him, a flicker of the girl she had been surfaced. She took the bread, her fingers brushing his, and the touch was like a spark in the gloom. "Nico," she said, her voice soft. "You shouldn't." "I know," he replied. The awkward tenderness between them was a fragile thing, a tiny bastion against the crushing weight of the city. They didn't speak of the past, it was too painful. Instead, they shared the silence, a communion of two souls clinging to wreckage. Their stolen moment was shattered by a commotion at the rail yard's main gate. Two heralds of Beelzebub, their forms a grotesque fusion of man and fly, their wings buzzing with a sound like grinding teeth, nailed fresh proclamations to the splintered wood. The first was from Plague Knight Tithonus of Flies, a high-ranking member of the Order of the Fly. His writ, scrawled on vellum that seemed to pulse with a sickly life, requisitioned the next sublimation cohort for immediate processing. The list of names included Elodie's. The second proclamation was from Praetor Magistrate Nargil, a demonic commander born of beast and devil, his authority stamped with a goetic sigil that smoked faintly. His rival writ claimed the same living stock, designating them as prime material for the insatiable engines that powered his cohort's war efforts. The conflicting orders ignited a tension that was as palpable as the city's stench. The fragile hierarchy of Avignon's damned rulers was fracturing, and the pawns were about to be caught in the middle. Elodie's breath hitched. She clutched the half-eaten bread as if it were a lifeline. "Nico," she whispered, her voice trembling. She leaned closer, her confession a terrified sigh. "The flies, they've started to sing. Inside my mouth, when I sleep, I can hear them." A cold dread, colder than the mud seeping through his boots, gripped Nico's heart. It was the first sign, the telltale whisper of the Black Grail's corruption taking root. The sublimation Tithonus promised was not an ascent but a consumption, a transformation into something like the heralds that now patrolled the skies. Nargil's alternative was no better, a draining of her essence to fuel some infernal machine. He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and made a promise he had no idea how to keep. "I'll find a way," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I'll get you out of here." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He was a handler of yoke fiends, a nobody. The way he spoke of did not yet exist, a path he would have to carve with nothing but desperation and a stolen moment of tenderness beside a frog-choked cistern. The rest of the day passed in a blur of monotonous labor. Nico worked with a frantic energy, his mind racing. He guided his assigned yoke fiend, a hulking brute named Grimald by the previous handler, whose tongue had been ripped out in a frenzy through its tasks. The creature stank of brimstone and open sores, its harness creaking as it dragged pallets of soul jars towards the magistrate's fortified wagons. Everywhere he looked, the rival factions were posturing. Nargil's Hell Knights, their forms entirely encased in cursed silent armor, stood guard over the stockpiles, their presence a cold threat. Tithonus's missionaries moved through the yard with a swaggering confidence, their deformed features twisted in zealous certainty. As the weak sun began to sink, casting long, distorted shadows from the broken architecture, Nico finished his shift. The air grew colder, and the sentient wire along the perimeter seemed to grow more alert, its barbs twitching. He made his way back towards the cramped, foul-smelling barracks allotted to the handlers, his body aching with a fatigue that was more soul-deep than physical. He passed the cistern again. It was empty now, but he could still see the ghost of Elodie's presence, the memory of her fearful confession. The promise he had made echoed in his skull, a desperate vow against impossible odds. He had hoarded a few food chits, scraps of value in this economy of misery. They were his only capital. Perhaps they could buy a foreman's momentary blindness, a stamp on a false transfer order. It was a plan woven from spider silk, but it was all he had. He reached the barracks, a long, low building that had once been a train shed. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap alcohol, and despair. Other handlers slumped on their cots, their faces blank with resignation. Nico found his own space, a narrow bunk against a damp wall. He sat on the thin, stained mattress, the straw crunching underneath him. From a hidden crevice in the wall, he retrieved his small hoard, a handful of bone-colored chits. He counted them again, though he knew the number by heart. 6. Enough for a bribe, perhaps. But to whom? Hugh, the rail yard foreman, had a reputation for deals. He had a split palate that gave his speech a wet, slopping quality, and a notorious taste for honey, a commodity as rare as hope in Avignon. Nico clutched the chits in his fist. The flies sing inside her mouth. The words were a chill that would not leave him. He looked around the barracks at the broken men, their spirits crushed by the relentless machinery of damnation. He would not become one of them. He would not let Elodie become one of the headless choristers or fuel for a Getic engine. The way would present itself. It had to. He lay back on the bunk, staring at the rusted iron ceiling, and listened to the city's night symphony. The distant hum of the choristers, the occasional shriek of something unnatural, and the ever-present, breathing rustle of the sentient wire. Somewhere out there, Elodie was listening to the same sounds, and to the flies singing their terrible hymn beneath her tongue. Nico closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to plan. The first chapter of their escape had begun, written not in ink, but in mud and a piece of honeyed bread. Chapter 2. Flies and Chains. The fragile balance of Avignon's rival hells collapsed with the grating of iron-shod wheels on cobblestones. The following morning, as a sickly dawn bled through the perpetual smog, Plague Knight Tithonus of Flies arrived at the rail yard to claim his due. He rode a palanquin borne by 4 hulking, fly-blinded thralls, his own form shrouded in robes that seemed woven from solidified plague mist. A contingent of his heralds flanked him, their wings a dissonant drone that set Nico's teeth on edge. They moved with a purpose that brooked no opposition, heading straight for the platform where the sublimants, including Elodie, were being marshaled under the watchful eyes of Nargil's Hell Knights. The response from Praetor Magistrate Nargil was immediate and brutal. His cohort countered by blocking the access ramps with a line of whipped yoke fiends. The brutish creatures snarled and strained against their torment gears, their eternal hatred focused on the newcomers. The rail yard, a place of grim industry, became an arena. Handlers like Nico scrambled to control their charges, the air thickening with the stink of fear and demonic sweat. The tension was a physical weight, a storm about to break. It broke with the crack of a single sentient bullet. One of Tithonus's heralds, its compound eyes glinting, raised a pistol that seemed grown from chitin and bone. It fired not at a Hell Knight, but at a handler who had moved too slowly. The bullet did not fly straight. It curved through the air like a hunting wasp, a silver-black streak that drilled into the man's cheek, burrowing deep with a sound of grinding bone. The handler screamed, a high, wet sound that was cut short as the bullet did its work from the inside out. He collapsed, twitching, as flies began to boil from his mouth and eyes. A hunter of the left-hand path, a sorcerer assassin of the court of the 7-headed serpent, clad in a cloak of stargazing oracle beast skins, stepped from the shadows behind Nargil's line. His left arm was a bow, transformed by infernal iron nails driven into the flesh. He unfurled his weapon, a tormentor chain, its hooked links slithering across the ground like a metallic serpent, seeking living flesh to capture and torment for goetic rituals. Tithonus did not flinch. From within his robes he unfurled a fog of flies, a living, buzzing cloud that poured forth like smoke. As the chain lashed out, he intoned a plague psalm, his voice a guttural chant that made the air vibrate. The words were a corruption of sacred text, a weapon in themselves. The tormentor chain, upon touching the edge of the fly cloud, recoiled as if from a white-hot brand. The hooks writhed, repelled by the sheer concentrated vileness of the psalm. The living fog swirled around Tithonus, a protective shroud of pestilence. In the ensuing chaos, Nico fought a private war. His yoke fiend, Grimald, sensing the frenzy and the spilt blood, began to buck and roar against its harness. The creature's raw strength was immense, and the leather straps groaned under the strain. Nico pulled on the control rods, his muscles burning, shouting commands the fiend barely understood. "Steady! Damn you, steady!" Spittle flew from his lips as he wrestled with the beast, his world narrowing to the fight for control. To lose command now meant being torn apart by his own charge. He saw a chorister, its headless body standing near the platform, caught in the crossfire. A stray blast from a Hell Knight's weapon, a gout of black energy, tore through it. The unholy hymn it was humming cut off into a wet gurgle as the torso unraveled, collapsing into a pile of twitching limbs and dissipating black mist. A moment later, a junior missionary, a young man Nico had seen Elodie speak with, was engulfed by Tithonus's fly cloud. The man clawed at his throat, his eyes bulging as the flies poured into his mouth and nose, suffocating him from the inside. His body convulsed and then went still, a nest for the buzzing swarm. "Nico!" Elodie's cry cut through the din. She was caught between the advancing heralds and the defensive line of yoke fiends. A Praetorian guardsman, seeing her hesitate, raised a barbed lash. Nico acted on instinct. He slammed the control rods hard, forcing Grimald into a momentary lurch that created a gap. He sprinted, his boots slipping in the mud, and grabbed Elodie's arm, yanking her backwards just as the lash came down. The tip caught his hand, splitting the flesh open in a line of fire. He gritted his teeth against the pain and dragged her under the relative shelter of a sagging flat car, its iron belly smelling of rust and old blood. They huddled in the dimness, the conflict raging above and around them. The sounds of clashing weapons, snarling fiends, and chanting psalms were deafening. Nico clutched his bleeding hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elodie pressed against him, her body trembling. Through the wheels of the flat car, they watched as Tithonus pointed a long, chitinous finger directly at their hiding spot. The scribe Mercier, his voice rasped, cutting through the noise. She is marked. Her ascension is ordained for 3 nights hence. Do not spoil the stock, Nargile. The praetor magistrate, his 3-faced helm swiveling to regard the plague knight, let out a derisive snort that sounded like grinding stone. Plague-spoiled stock, Nargile snarled. Useless for my engines. Your petty rituals waste good flesh, Tithonus. This rivalry costs us both. The exchange revealed the truth of their situation. Elodie was not a person to these powers. She was a resource, a pawn in a personal and political feud between a demonic magistrate and a fanatical plague knight. Her value was solely in her corruption, a commodity to be spent by one or consumed by the other. As the two factions continued their standoff, hurling insults and magical threats, Nico knew they had only seconds. The focus was on the commanders now, but it wouldn't last. He looked at Elodie, her face pale with terror, and saw the hopelessness in her eyes. He had promised her a way out. Now was the moment. "We have to move," he whispered urgently. While they're distracted, he led her on a desperate crawl, staying low beneath the line of flat cars. They moved away from the central conflict, towards the edge of the yard where the land sloped down towards the cloister district. The sentient wire here was less dense, but it still twitched at their approach. They slipped past a gap where the wire had been torn in some past skirmish, its severed ends curled back like dead vines. Their flight took them into the shadows of the desecrated cloister, its once holy stones now crusted with foul residues and pulsing with a low infernal hum. Nico remembered an old, half-flooded crypt from his childhood, a place he and other boys had dared each other to enter. It was accessed through a broken grating near the base of the wall, half hidden by thorny brambles. He found it, the iron bars bent and rusted. He squeezed through, then helped Elodie after him. They dropped into ankle-deep, icy water. The air was thick with the smell of mud, decay, and the faint, ghostly scent of old incense that refused to be completely eradicated. The only light came from a few faint, phosphorescent fungi growing on the submerged stone ribs of the vaulted ceiling. The crypt was vast, its far end lost in darkness, and the silence was broken only by the dripping of water and the croaking of frogs that inhabited this sunken world. They were in the frog crypt. Fear, mud, and the oppressive smell of a violated sanctity pressed in on them. They had escaped the immediate clash, but they were trapped, hunted, and time was the one enemy they could not fight. Elodie's ascension was in 3 nights. Nico looked at her, shivering in the stagnant water, and knew their plan, born of desperation in this sunken tomb, would have to be forged and executed in less time than that. There was no time for perfection, only for action. The mud of the crypt clung to their boots, a grim reminder that their path to freedom would be paved with the filth of the city they sought to escape. Chapter 3. A Plan Sewn from Rags. The frog crypt was a cathedral of silence after the roaring chaos of the rail yard. The only sounds were the drip of water from the crumbling stone ceiling, and the occasional plop as a frog broke the scummy surface of the flooded floor. The air was cold and heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth, decay, and that stubborn, ghostly trace of sanctity that refused to be entirely extinguished. In the faint, greenish light of the phosphorescent fungi, Nico could see the terror still etched on Elodie's face. She hugged herself, shivering. "I can feel them," she whispered, her voice echoing softly in the cavernous space. "The flies. It's not just a sound anymore. It's a vibration, like they're humming just beneath my tongue." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a horror that went beyond fear. It was the dread of a body becoming alien, a soul being evicted by a crawling, buzzing tenant. Nico tore a strip of cloth from the hem of his tunic and began wrapping his bleeding hand. The lash wound was deep and stung fiercely, but the pain was a grounding force. "I have chits," he said, his voice low and practical, a counterpoint to her despair. "Food chits. I've been hoarding them for months. I was going to use them to bribe a foreman, get us transferred to a work detail near the perimeter." It was a paltry, half-formed dream from a time when escape seemed a distant possibility, not an immediate necessity. Elodie stared at him, a flicker of something other than fear in her eyes. "You were planning this?" "Not this," he admitted, gesturing to the dank crypt around them. "Just something, a way to get you away from the missionaries." The confession hung between them, a testament to his long-held, silent determination. In the oppressive quiet, the space between them diminished. It was not a calculated move, but an instinctual convergence born of shared desperation. Their brief, desperate kiss was less an indulgence than a vow. It tasted of mud and fear, but also of a promise reforged in the darkness. It was a seal upon a pact made not for joy, but for survival. When they parted, the air had changed. The plan was no longer an abstract notion, it was a shared mission. "The corpse caravan," Nico said, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "It shunts flat cars out every night, through the wire, towards no man's land. If we could get on one, vanish in a load of the dead." Elodie's eyes narrowed, thinking it through. "They check the manifests. The handlers use a special chalk to mark the loads. And the workers, they have stamped wrist rings. Without them, we'd be spotted instantly." "Then we need the rings and the chalk," Nico stated, "and we need them tonight." The audacity of it was staggering. To steal from the very machinery of damnation and use it as their vehicle out. "Hugh," Nico said. The foreman's name was a sour taste in his mouth. "He has access to the stamps, and he has a taste for honey." "Honey?" Elodie asked, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "In Avignon? A luxury, a vice. Everyone has one." Nico's mind was racing now, calculating risks. "I'll go to him. I'll bargain." He waited until the shift change, when the yard would be at its most chaotic. Leaving Elodie hidden in a dryish niche near the crypt's entrance, he slipped back out into the twilight of the cloister grounds. He moved like a shadow, avoiding the patrols of listless thralls and the occasional skulking herald. He found Hugh in his makeshift office, a repurposed stone cell near the rail yard's main storehouse. The foreman was a hulking man with a brutish face and the telltale split palate that made his speech a wet, slopping sound. "Lorraine," Hugh grunted, not looking up from a manifest scrawled on a cracked slate. "Heard you caused a stir, lost a good fiend in the ruckus." "Grimald's fine," Nico lied. "I need a favor, Hugh." The foreman looked up, his small eyes glinting with avarice. "Favors cost." Nico laid 5 of his 6 food chits on the table. The bone-colored tokens looked pathetic against the grimy slate. "I need 2 stamped wrist rings and a handler's chalk." Hugh stared at the chits, then let out a wet, gurgling laugh. "You think that's enough for a one-way ticket out of here, boy? That's not a favor, that's a death wish, for both of us." He pushed the chits back across the table. "But I might have a job, a different kind of favor. You do this for me, and maybe we talk about your rings." Nico's heart sank. "What job?" "The missionaries," Hugh said, lowering his voice. "They've been hoarding something in their storehouse, a special delivery, a crate. Nargil wants it, badly, but Tithonus has it under guard. I need a yoke fiend team to drag it out and load it onto Nargil's personal wagon. Tonight, quietly." Nico understood instantly. He was being asked to escalate the very rivalry that had put Elodie in danger, to steal from the plague knights for the praetor magistrate. It was a suicide mission, but it was also access. It was a reason to be near the storehouse, near the caravans. "The crate. What is it?" Hugh shrugged his massive shoulders. "Rumor says it's a church weapon, something they captured, a vivisection lance. Nargil thinks it'll give him an edge." He leaned forward, his breath foul. "You get that crate to the wagon, Lorraine. You align your fiends, you do the work, and I'll get you your rings, and your chalk." Nico looked at the foreman's greedy face and saw no loyalty, only opportunity. He would agree, he would play his part. But in his mind, a new plan was forming. He wouldn't just deliver the crate. He would find a way to sabotage the transfer, to create the chaos they needed to slip away. He would use Hughes's greed as his own weapon. "I'll do it," he said. When he returned to the crypt, Elodie was waiting, her face a mask of anxiety. He told her of the deal, omitting the most dangerous parts. As he finished, she looked at him, her expression unreadable in the gloom. "Nico," she said softly, "do you love me, or is it just the girl you remember, the one from before the flies?" The question hung in the stagnant air, more terrifying than any tormentor chain. He thought of the honeyed bread, of her laughter by the cistern, of the fear in her eyes now. He thought of the promise he had made, not to a memory, but to the woman trembling before him. "I love the girl you were," he said, his voice steady, "and I love the woman you are, fighting this thing inside you, and I will love the woman you will be when we reach the morning alive." It was the truest thing he had ever said. Their fragile plan, a thing of rags and desperation, was set. But as Nico left the crypt to prepare for the night's work, he saw Hugh overseeing the unloading of a long, narrow crate from a guarded wagon. The foreman handled it with a strange reverence. As the crate was carried into the storehouse, a herald announced to the gathering missionaries that this was the Vivisector, a trophy seized from a captured church combat biologist. And it would be unveiled, he proclaimed with zealous pride, during the ascension ceremony of the scribe Elodie Mercier in 3 nights' time. The risk Nico was about to take had just transformed. The crate was no longer just a means to an end. It was the very object at the center of the coming storm. Their desperate gamble had suddenly become an opportunity they could never have imagined. Chapter 4. The Knife and the Frog Crypt. The unveiling of the Vivisector was staged as a public spectacle, a piece of grim theater designed to demoralize any lingering resistance and glorify the power of the Black Grail. In the main square before the desecrated cathedral, a platform had been erected. Strapped to a blackened lectern at its center was a woman. Her robes, though torn and stained, marked her as a combat biologist of the Church's pontifical office. This was Sister Valera di Siena. Her head was held fast by a contraption of buzzing, metal tongues that clamped her jaw shut, preventing speech but not the defiant fire in her eyes. Around her, Tithonus of Flies paced, his voice a rasping sermon about the weakness of God's creations and the inevitable victory of Beelzebub's plague. Nico watched from the edges of the crowd, his handler's credentials granting him a clear view. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. Elodie was somewhere nearby, forced to attend as the guest of dishonor, the centerpiece of the impending ascension. The plan was insanity itself. He was to use his knowledge of the yard's mechanics to trip the winch controlling the lectern at a crucial moment. Elodie, positioned near a brazier of smoldering incense, was to create a diversion. Tithonus raised the Vivisector for the crowd to see. It was a brutal, beautiful weapon. A long polearm shaft culminated not in a simple blade, but in a viciously curved hook and a needle-like injector assembly. It was a tool of dissection and agony, inlaid with slivers of holy relic that made the surrounding heralds flinch. "With this sacred blade of the so-called faithful," Tithonus crowed, "we shall perform the ultimate blessing upon the Grail. Let this biologist's own instrument turn her faith to despair." As he placed the Vivisector against Sister Valera's throat, Nico acted. He slipped behind the platform, found the winch mechanism, and with a well-aimed kick from his heavy boot, jammed a metal shard into the gears. There was a loud crack, a shriek of protesting metal, and the lectern lurched violently sideways. At the same moment, Elodie stumbled against the brazier, sending a cloud of thick, fragrant ash billowing into the face of a nearby herald. The creature shrieked, its compound eyes blinded by the holy residue mixed with the incense. Chaos erupted. The lectern, now unbalanced, toppled. Sister Valera, with a strength born of desperation, twisted free of the loosened restraints. Her hand shot out, grabbing the shaft of the Vivisector as it fell from Tithonus's grasp. In one fluid motion, she was on her feet, the weapon now hers. She didn't hesitate. With a sweep of the blade, she carved a path through the stunned heralds, the relic edges causing their flesh to sizzle and smoke. "Now!" Nico yelled, grabbing Elodie's arm. They sprinted from the platform, following the fleeing biologist into the labyrinthine shadows of the ruined cloister. Shouts and the buzz of enraged flies followed them, but the confusion was their ally. Valera moved with a predator's efficiency, leading them through gaps in walls and down alleys known only to those who mapped the city's decay. Soon, The sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the dripping silence of the frog crypt. They collapsed against the cold stone, breathing in ragged gasps. The green fungal light illuminated their savior. Sister Valera was austere, her face all sharp angles and grim determination. She examined the vivisector in her hands, her touch both clinical and reverent. "You risked much," she said, her voice low and precise, devoid of gratitude. It was a statement of fact. "They were going to kill her," Nico said, gesturing to Elodie, who was trembling, her hand pressed to her throat as if to quiet the internal humming. Valera's eyes, sharp and intelligent, assessed Elodie. "The flies, you are a sublimant." It wasn't a question. The Grail's hold is a spiritual poison, a metaphysical infection. But all infections can be treated. She turned the vivisector, examining the reservoir chamber. "I can brew a counter-agent, a serum. It will not cure her, but it will bludgeon the connection, dull the Grail's voice. It will buy time." "How?" Nico demanded, hope flaring painfully in his chest. "The weapon's cocktail is a mix of toxins and sacred compounds," she explained. "I can repurpose it, but I need a mortar and pestle. I need wine, unconsecrated but clean. And most importantly, I need dust from a holy relic. The purer, the better. The microshards in this blade are potent, but they are tuned for pain. I need a source of pure, unadulterated grace." Elodie looked up, her face pale. "There are no relics left. The missionaries looted everything." "Not everything," Valera countered, a flicker of something akin to a smile touching her lips. "They are thorough, but arrogant. They failed to recover the knee bones of Saint Benezet from the flood when they took the city. The relics were in a side chapel under the broken bridge. The Rhone claimed them, and the missionaries, in their pride, believed the river had done their work of desecration for them. But water does not unmake faith. It only hides it." The broken Pont Saint-Benezet was a skeleton stretching into the river, its arches shattered, a monument to loss. It was also heavily patrolled, its approaches watched by sentient wire and heralds on the wing. "It's suicide," Nico breathed. "It is necessity," Valera replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "The serum will suppress the transformation for a day, perhaps 2. Without it, her ascension will proceed as Tithonus has ordained." She looked between them, her gaze pragmatic. "I will craft this for you. In return, you will help me get this," she hefted the vivisector, "out of the city. My mission was to recover it. That has not changed." A bargain was struck there in the mud, between a handler, a scribe, and a soldier of God. It was not born of friendship, but of mutual need. Nico and Elodie needed Valera's knowledge to fight a corruption of the soul. Valera needed their knowledge of the city's underbelly to escape with her prize. Their fates were now inextricably linked, a trinity of desperation bound by a knife and a crypt full of frogs. The plan had evolved. They were no longer just fleeing, they were on a mission, and their first objective lay beneath the dark, cold waters of the Rhone. Chapter 5. Beneath the Broken Bridge. The night was a shroud of fog rolling off the Rhone, a cold, damp blanket that clung to the ruins of Avignon. Wrapped in its gray embrace, the trio moved like ghosts through the skeletal remains of the city's riverside districts. The broken Pont Saint-Benezet loomed ahead, its arches like the ribs of a drowned leviathan against the starless sky. Their objective was the drowned chapel, a place of failed sanctity now guarded by the city's infernal sentinels. The greatest of these was the sentient barbed wire that hung in thick, kelp-like coils along the riverbank and the bridge's stone approaches. It was not merely a barrier, it was a predator, its barbs twitching and tasting the air for the heat of living footsteps. Nico carried a small, grimy lamp, its oil half depleted. The plan was simple, desperate, and born of his handler's knowledge. As they approached the first tangled mass of wire, he uncorked the lamp and sprinkled a thin line of oil on the cobblestones, a safe distance away. With a strike of his flint, he set it alight. A small, hungry flame sprang to life. The wire reacted instantly. The coils tensed, slithering towards the new heat source, the sudden flare confusing its primitive senses. It was a brief distraction, a window of perhaps 30 seconds. "Go," Nico hissed. They scrambled past the distracted wire, their boots slipping on the wet stones. Elodie clutched the sacked vivisector to her chest, its weight a grim promise. Valera led the way, her eyes scanning the waterline. She found what she was looking for, a culvert, half submerged, that had once drained into the chapel. The opening was small, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, and the dark water that flowed from it smelled of rust and rot. A faint, coppery taste hung in the air around it. "The coin-tasting culvert," Valera said softly. Pilgrims would toss coins in for luck. The water was said to bless them. Now it was a sewer. "I'll go first." She waded into the icy water and disappeared into the darkness. Nico gestured for Elodie to follow. With a terrified glance back at the city's glowing pestilence, she took a deep breath and plunged in. Nico followed last, the cold water shocking the breath from his lungs. They emerged inside the drowned chapel. The vaulted stone ribs of the ceiling arched overhead, just barely breaking the surface of the black water. Fish, pale and blind from the eternal gloom, nosed at the stubs of votive candles that had long since been extinguished. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water and the soft lapping against the stone. It was a tomb, a place where holiness had been suffocated. Valera waded towards the far end, where a silted altar was barely visible beneath the water. She began to hum a soft, ancient melody, a kyrie. The notes, pure and clear, seemed to vibrate in the stagnant air. The water around the altar shivered as if responding to the sacred sound, and a faint, golden glow seemed to emanate from the silt below. "There," she said, pointing. "The reliquary was embedded in the altar stone. The river has covered it, but it is there." Nico waded over, his belt buckle in hand. He took a deep breath and dove under the frigid water. His hands groped in the murky darkness, feeling the slime-covered stone of the altar. He scraped and pried, his lungs burning, until his fingers found a loose edge. He worked the buckle into the crack and levered with all his strength. A piece of stone and something with it came free. He surfaced, gasping, holding a small, water-worn bone shard. It was unremarkable, yet it felt warm in his hand. Elodie, watching from a few feet away, began to weep silently, her tears mingling with the chapel's water. "We are desecrating a saint," she whispered, her voice thick with shame. Valera took the bone shard from Nico, her touch respectful but firm. "Saints are not in the bones, child," she said, her voice echoing softly in the cavernous space. "They are in the acts they inspire. Saints prefer rescue to reverence when the living are at stake. This shard will not remember your desecration. It will remember the life it helped save." Her words were not gentle, but they were true, and they steadied Elodie's trembling. Their moment of success was shattered by a shift in the air above. A shadow fell across the mouth of the culvert. A hunter of the left-hand path stood on the broken bridge above them, his cloak of oracle beast skins making him almost one with the night. The pale, living eyes sewn into the fabric swiveled, fixing on their position. He said nothing, but he unlimbered his transformed armbow. Worse, a tormentor chain, its hooks glinting, snaked down from the bridge like a fishing line, dipping into the water near them. It moved with a malevolent intelligence, probing, searching. Nico's blood ran cold. They were trapped. To go back out the culvert was to meet the hunter. To stay was to be caught by the chain. But the rivalries of Avignon saved them once more. As the hunter took aim, a swarm of flies, Tithonus's signature, surged along the riverbank nearby. A moment later, the rough voice of Nargil's adjutant shouted from the opposite direction, "Jurisdiction! The bridge and its spoils fall under the magistrate's decree." An argument erupted between the unseen factions above them. The hunter hesitated, his allegiance to the court conflicting with the direct orders of the local powers. The tormentor chain went momentarily slack, its master's attention divided. It was the distraction they needed. "Now," Valera commanded. They bolted for the culvert. As Nico went to duck through, the chain, sensing their movement, lashed out again, snaking towards Elodie's ankle. Without thinking, Nico swung the sacked Vivisector. The cloth wrapping fell away, and the relic edge of the blade slashed across the chain. There was a shriek of tormented metal and a flash of silver light. The chain seized up, the hooks writhing impotently, its magical connection severed by the holy weapon. They scrambled out into the river fog, gasping and shivering. But their escape was not unseen. As they melted into the shadows of a collapsed warehouse, a figure stepped from a doorway. It was Hugh, the foreman. His eyes went immediately from their dripping forms to the unveiled vivisector in Nico's hand. Recognition flashed in his gaze, followed by a calculating coldness. He could have raised the alarm then and there. Instead, he feigned a casual ignorance, nodding curtly as if they were merely workers on an errand. But as they hurried away, Nico failed to notice the subtle signal Hughes made. The foreman didn't shout. He simply took a small, fly-pinned token from his pocket and flicked it onto the ground near the culvert, a silent, treacherous breadcrumb for Tithonus's heralds to follow. He had seen the weapon, and he knew which master would pay a higher price for such a prize. Their risk had bought them the relic shard, but it had also sold them out. The noose was tightening. Chapter 6. Serum of Shards. The return to the frog crypt was a silent, frantic sprint through back alleys and flooded basements. Every shadow seemed to hold the buzz of flies, every echo the clank of a Hell Knight's armor. When they finally dropped back into the stagnant water of the crypt, the relief was a physical ache. They had the bone shard, but they had also been seen. The clock was ticking louder now. Valera did not waste a moment. She cleared a flat stone on a dry section of the crypt floor, creating a makeshift workbench. From a small, oilskin pouch on her belt, she produced a pestle and a few vials containing dried, aromatic compounds, sacred substances from her lectern kits. She added a splash of the altar wine she had taken from the chapel, the liquid a pale gold in the dim light. Then, with reverence, she placed the bone shard of Saint Benezet into the stone mortar. "The essence of grace is a weapon against this kind of corruption," she murmured, more to herself than to them, as she began to grind the shard. The sound of the pestle against the stone was rhythmic, purposeful. The bone did not grind easily. It was as if the material resisted its own destruction, but slowly, inexorably, it was reduced to a fine, pearlescent dust that seemed to hold a light of its own. She mixed the relic dust with the compounds in the wine, stirring until it formed a thick, glowing paste. She carefully decanted this into the reservoir chamber of the Vivisector, using the weapon's own precision mechanisms to blend the new serum with the existing cocktail of toxins and nerve agents. The candle they had lit guttered, casting long, dancing shadows as she worked, her face a mask of intense concentration. Finally, she looked at Elodie. "It is ready. This will be severe. The holy energy will clash directly with the infernal presence. It will feel like a war inside you." Elodie's face was pale, but her jaw was set. She had seen the alternative in the hollow eyes of the choristers. She bared her shoulder, the skin already showing a faint tracery of black veins beneath the surface. Nico moved to her side, steadying her head with his hands. His touch was gentle, but his own fear was a cold stone in his gut. Valera pressed the injector tip of the Vivisector against Elodie's skin. There was a faint hiss as the mechanism engaged. Elodie gasped, her body rigid. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then she screamed. It was a short, sharp cry of pure agony that was cut off as her eyes rolled back in her head. Nico held her tight as she convulsed, a silent battle raging within her. He could almost hear it, the screaming of the flies as the holy serum bludgeoned their connection to the Grail, a sound of psychic torment that made the very air vibrate. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Elodie went limp in his arms, breathing in ragged, sobbing gasps. The frantic, internal humming that had been her constant companion was gone. In its place was a ringing, painful silence. She looked up at him, her eyes clear for the first time in weeks, though shadowed with exhaustion and trauma. "They're quiet," she whispered, awe and relief mixing in her voice. "The silence will not last," Valera said, cleaning the Vivisector's needle with a methodical efficiency. "The Grail's hold is tenacious. You have perhaps 48 hours of clarity. If grace holds." She then took a small amount of the leftover relic paste and, using a fine tool from her kit, began etching a new, delicate prayer line into the shaft of the Vivisector. "Retuning it," she explained. "The weapon was designed to cause pain to infernal beings. Now it will be better suited to defending against them." She finished her work and gave Nico a pinch of the powdered relic salt. "Smear this around her throat, like a ring, whenever you feel the fly crown try to seat. It will act as a barrier. It will burn, but it is better than the alternative." Their fragile peace was interrupted by the sound of someone sloshing through the crypt's entrance. Nico tensed, reaching for a rusty iron bar, but it was Hugh. The foreman looked nervous, his eyes darting around the crypt. He tossed a small bundle onto the dry stone. It contained 2 stamped wrist rings and a piece of handler's chalk. "The caravan leaves at the 3rd bell," Hugh said, his voice a wet whisper. "The far western spur. Be on the flat car marked with a red X. It's the last one. Don't be late." He was trembling, and a sheen of sweat glistened on his brow. He couldn't meet their eyes. "You're keeping your word?" Nico asked, suspicion coiling in his gut. "A deal's a deal," Hughes mumbled, already backing away. "3rd bell. Don't forget." He turned and hurried out of the crypt, his bulk disappearing into the darkness. Nico's suspicion should have been screaming. Hughes's fear, his sudden compliance, it was all wrong. But the lure of the wrist rings, the tangible key to their escape, was too strong. He was so focused on the means of their flight that he failed to notice the final damning act. As Hughes left, the foreman's hand slipped into his pocket and discreetly tucked a fly-pinned token into a crack in the crypt's entrance, a clear marker for Tithonus's heralds. He had delivered the bait, and now he was laying the trap. In the quiet that followed, the reality of their situation settled upon them. They had a weapon, a serum, and a way out. The plan was in motion. For a few precious hours, the immediate pressure eased. Exhausted, they huddled together for warmth. In the stillness, Elodie turned to Nico. This time their kiss was different. It was not a vow born of desperation, but an affirmation of presence. It was filled with the fragile hope of a future, rather than the grim nostalgia of a past. It was a kiss for the woman she was now, and for the man he was becoming in this struggle. Valera watched them from across the crypt, her expression unreadable. The austere lines of her face softened for a moment, not with sentiment, but with a quiet acknowledgement of their humanity. It was a vigilance that had not surrendered, but had made room for a sliver of compassion. They had bought themselves a night. The alarms were silent, but Hugh had sounded a silent one of his own, and it was only a matter of time before it was heard. Chapter 7. Dogs of the 7 Heads. The 3rd bell was a mournful, resonant tone that echoed through the perpetual gloom of Avignon, signaling the shift of the infernal watch. It was the hour when the corpse caravan was made ready, when the city purged itself of the day's dead and damned. This was their moment. Disguised in stolen, stinking porter smocks, their faces smeared with grime, Nico, Elodie, and Valera slipped from the frog crypt and merged with a work detail trudging towards the rail yard's western spur. The night was cold, and a fine, oily rain began to fall. The sentient barbed wire along the perimeter lay unusually slack, sated from the day's feed of unlucky escapees and punished thralls. It was a small mercy. They moved with their heads down, mimicking the shuffling gait of the broken souls around them. Nico's heart hammered against his ribs. Each beat a loud drum in his ears. He clutched the stamped wrist ring on his arm, feeling the cheap metal bite into his skin. Elodie walked beside him, her breathing steady but shallow. Valera brought up the rear, the vivisector concealed within a rolled-up shroud, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows. They reached the loading area. The flat cars were lined up, heaped with shrouded forms. The air was thick with the smell of death and coal smoke. Handlers moved through the gloom, marking loads with chalk. Nico saw the car marked with a faded red X at the very end of the train, their ticket to no man's land. He allowed himself a flicker of hope. It died the moment he made eye contact with Sister Nim. A missionary with lips crudely stitched together, she was overseeing the loading. Her gaze swept over the work detail, impersonal and cold, until it landed on Elodie. She studied her for a fraction too long, her head tilting like a bird of prey. The flies might have been silenced, but the taint of the grail was still a scent to these hounds. Before Nico could react, a figure stepped from the deeper shadows between 2 freight cars. Tithonus of flies. The plague knight's robes seemed to drink the feeble light. "The timetable has moved forward, scribe," he rasped, his voice cutting through the din of labor. "Your ascension is now. The grail hungers." He murmured a command, and 2 of his heralds moved to flank Elodie. Simultaneously, from the opposite direction, a Hell Knight from Nargil's cohort advanced, its armored feet crunching on the gravel. "Prime material," it intoned, its voice a hollow echo from within its helm. "The magistrate claims this stock for the engines." It reached a gauntleted hand towards Elodie. They were caught in a pincer movement between the two rival powers. The standoff from days before was reigniting, and they were the prize. It was Hugh who broke, his nerve finally shattering under the pressure. Unable to bear the scrutiny of both masters, he pointed a trembling finger directly at them from where he stood near the locomotive. "There, the handler, the scribe, they have the weapon, the Vivisector!" The fragile illusion of their disguise evaporated. Tithonus's eyes glinted with avaricious fury. Nargil's Hell Knight snarled, a sound of grinding rocks. The retinues surged forward, flies and goetic sigils flaring in the damp night air. Valera was the first to move. As a herald lunged for her, she spun the shroud away from the Vivisector and drove the needle tip deep into the creature's thigh. It shrieked, not in pain but in outrage, as the holy compounds and nerve agents flooded its infernal system. It stumbled back, its wing buzzing erratically. Nico didn't think. He saw a heavy rail pin lying nearby. He grabbed it and with a grunt of effort levered it against the wheel of the nearest flat car. The car, loaded with bodies, groaned and then dropped off the tracks with a deafening crash, creating a temporary, macabre barricade between them and the bulk of Nargil's forces. Elodie, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a heavy smoking censer from a nearby brazier. She swung it like a flail, the chain whistling through the air. It connected with the grasping hand of a missionary, and the hot metal and holy ash sent the creature reeling back with a cry of pain. But they were too many. From the shadows above, a tormentor chain snaked down, its hook expertly catching Elodie's ankle. The barb bit deep, and she cried out as she was yanked off her feet. The chain began to retract, dragging her towards the waiting hunter. Nico leaped. He grabbed the chain with his bare hands, the hooks tearing into his palms. Ignoring the searing pain, he held on, gritting his teeth as the powerful winch tried to pull them both. Through the agony, he remembered Valera's relic salt. With a blood-slicked hand, he smeared a rough ring around Elodie's throat. The effect was instantaneous. As the hunter attempted to impose the fly crown, to mark her anew for ascension, the holy salt reacted. A shrieking silver-black vapor erupted from Elodie's skin where the ring had been drawn. The psychic backlash made the hunter stagger, and the chain went momentarily slack. Tithonus spat on the ground, his face a mask of disgust. "Spoiled stock. The connection is burned away." The serum had done its job too well. She was now useless to his rituals. Nargil's Hell Knight echoed the sentiment, its voice dripping with contempt. Useless to engines, the essence is corrupted. Their prized pawn was now worthless. The personal rivalry between the Plague Knight and the Praetor Magistrate, held in check only by the value of the prize, now boiled over into pure, unadulterated fury. Each blamed the other for the loss. Their forces, no longer constrained by the goal of capturing Elodie, turned on each other with vicious abandon. Flies swarmed Hell Knights, goetic blasts incinerated heralds, the rail yard became a raging melee. Valera saw their chance. While the two factions tore each other apart, she pressed a hidden catch on the Vivisector's shaft. A small-shaped charge, a last resort measure for denying the weapon to the enemy, detonated with a concussive thump. It wasn't meant to kill, but to rupture. The blast tore a gaping hole in the curtain of sentient wire nearby, the magical matrix that held it alive, fizzling and dying at the edges of the breach. "Go!" Valera yelled. The trio did not need telling twice. They bolted through the smoking breach, leaving the sounds of the internecine war behind them. Alarms began to rise across the city, but the masters who should have given chase were too consumed with their own bloody feud to notice 3 ordinary lives slipping through their fingers. They stumbled from the iron and stone of Avignon onto the cratered, open ground of no man's land. The cold air of the outside world hit them like a physical blow, clean and sharp and terrifyingly vast. They were not safe, but they were free. For now. Chapter 8. The Line of Salt. No man's land opened before them, a vast cratered desolation that stretched into a horizon of fire and smoke. The air was bitingly cold, carrying the stink of cordite, rot, and something else, a lingering psychic residue of endless conflict. Bent rebar crosses and the weathered stone faces of half-buried saints marked the mire, the only testament to the dead. In the distance, a sudden flare of crimson lit up the sky, A Red Brigade raid against a skeletal goetic relay tower, pulling heretic fire away from this narrow transient corridor of escape. Their flight was far from over. The sentient wire of Avignon, though breached, was not entirely defeated. A lone, severed strand, animated by a dying impulse, snaked across the mud after them, its barbs twitching, drawn to the unique signature of Elodie's fading corruption, the plague sweat that still seeped from her pores. "The salt," Valera snapped, her breath misting in the frigid air. "Now." Nico, his hands bleeding and raw from the chain, fumbled for the pouch. He smeared a fresh ring of the relic dust around Elodie's throat, mixing it with his own blood. The wire, upon touching the holy barrier, recoiled with a sizzle, curling back on itself like a scorched worm before falling inert. Valera lagged a few paces behind, her movements deliberate. From another pouch, she scavenged two small disc-like objects, two Fingiev-type anti-personnel mines, ingenious devices of the Sultanate's sappers. She seeded their back trail with them, a final, vicious gift for any pursuers. Her actions were cold, efficient. This was the calculus of survival. A shout echoed from the breach behind them. It was Hugh. The foreman, perhaps hoping for a last-minute reward or simply driven by a final, spiteful impulse, had followed. His bulky form was silhouetted against the glowing chaos of Avignon. He opened his mouth to shout again, but his warning was cut short by the muffled, coughing detonation of one of the mines. Valera did not look back. Her face was a stone mask. The living, her expression said, must not be forsaken to the experiments of hell for the sake of sentiment. Their flight became a desperate slog through the freezing muck. The craters were filled with icy water, and the mud clung to their boots like leaden weights. An arrow, fletched with black feathers, suddenly skimmed past Valera, tearing through her sleeve and drawing a line of blood across her ribs. A hunter, having broken free from the melee, was on their trail. She stumbled, but righted herself, clutching the vivisector tighter. "They will not take it," she swore, a vow not of hatred, but of duty. The living must not be forsaken. Just as exhaustion threatened to claim them, a sharp whistle chirped from a nearby communication trench. A figure rose from the earth, a scout clad in mud-caked gear, a coarse rosary looped around the stock of her rifle. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, went immediately to the distinctive silhouette of the vivisector in Valera's grip. "St. Ernest's compliments," the scout said, her voice rough but not unkind. She gestured with her head. "In here, quickly, and keep the salt line intact, you," she pointed at Elodie. "Hum low. Don't let the hymn rise." They half fell, half slid into the trench, a deep gash in the earth smelling of damp soil and men under strain. The scout, introducing herself simply as Anya, led them along the zigzagging path. "Quarantine for you once we're back," she said to Valera, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Cella obscura intake. Standard procedure for anything coming out of that pest hole." Valera met her gaze squarely. "I demand a chaplain who can say person without adding specimen." Anya nodded once, a gesture of understanding. "The Duke doesn't truck with that anymore, not after the Red Brigade." She glanced back at Nico and Elodie, who were supporting each other, their faces haggard but alive. "You picked a hell of a night to leave town. The whole wire's buzzing, but it seems they're too busy clawing each other's eyes out to mind the gate." Artillery thumped in the distance, a slow, rhythmic thunder beyond the ridge, a constant reminder that the war was everywhere. As they slogged towards the distant, flickering lights of the church's forward lines, the sounds of Avignon's internal war faded behind them, replaced by the more organized sounds of a battlefield. Elodie, walking beside Nico, began to hum. It was not the fly hymn of the Grail, but a simple old Avignon lullaby, a melody from a world that no longer existed. It was a song of resistance, a reclamation of her own voice. Nico, after a moment, began to hum with her. Their voices were weak, off-key, but they were their own. Valera walked a few steps ahead, her vigilance unwavering, but her posture had lost some of its razor edge. She was escorting them now, not just escaping with them. The three of them, the handler, the scribe, and the combat biologist, stepped out of the darkest shadow of the city that had claimed them. They moved toward a horizon that was more fire than dawn, toward uncertainty, interrogation, and the relentless grind of the Great War. But they moved together. Behind them, Hell's factions continued to tear at each other. their envy and ambition a cage they had built for themselves. Too consumed with their own reflection to notice 3 ordinary lives slipping away. They had crossed the line of salt. The morning was not a promise of peace, but it was a chance. And for those who had lived under Beelzebub's sway, a chance was everything.